So a very good evening, everyone. A warm welcome to St Michael's Parish Church here in Beccles. For those who don't know me, I'm Rich. I'm the rector here. And it's a privilege to welcome you all into this space this evening with 100 extra guests that I hope you'll explore a little later on. I just want to say some thank yous right at the beginning and say that we wanted to do this exhibition back in 2020 and had everything ready. John will say a bit more about how we came about getting hold of the shadows. But the pandemic stopped what was going to be a major festival for us to celebrate 650 years of this building on this site. So we're a couple of years on, and the shadows have been resident in Beccles all that time. I'm a pinching most your talk now. Yeah, okay. Thought it might be. But all that throughout that time, we've been waiting for the right moment to do this exhibition. It's going to run for the next 10 days. And a team have made it possible. So I just want to thank them now. So all our parish social and fundraising team, many are involved here tonight, whether it's serving drinks, preparing food, or being on the ticket desk. To John and Sue Bailey, and John will explain their role in a moment. They're on the fundraising committee, but they were very much key to this happening here. To Barry, who's going to give us our talk tonight, that has also produced all the history of the 100 characters around the building. To Faith, who printed them all off diligently, one at a time in the office. To Jill and Margaret, who laminated all of those words, and to Kate, who's our youth pastor, who's produced some resources for children as we're going into half term. There's some children's activity sheets at the back of the church, and we want to encourage you, if you've got grandchildren or neighbours with children, to get them to come in. There's some activities they can do that relate to some of the shadows, and they get a history detective badge for taking part. And then there's some resources for younger children as well. We are delighted to host this exhibition. We are glad it's happening, and we are thrilled you are here. So I'm going to hand over to John, who's going to say how it happened.
Good evening, everybody. Good evening, everybody. It's a great pleasure to see you all here, from myself and wife. I have to mention her, you always have to mention, find a slot somewhere. Back in 2020, Ivan Crane, is he here tonight? Yes. Yes, right. Ivan took us on a walk, one of the walks, and he said, I've just been to Tideswell in Derbyshire, and you can't guess what I'm seeing. And basically, these shadows were on display in Derbyshire. Similar sort of formats of the descriptions of people, not church people, all sorts of people really from Tideswell. And we said, well, we're going to Derbyshire, and that's obviously, well, not obviously, it's where my wife comes from. And, the phrase, doesn't it? Strong in the arm and so on. And anyway, we went to Tideswell. We could find nothing in the church with reference to these. And it's really, I don't want to go on for too long, but it's a little bit by chance that we did actually find where they were. We bought them, we brought them back here. And now, after our event here, we're hoping perhaps somebody else will use them again. Some other church, perhaps somewhere else. I don't think it needs to be a church necessarily, but we hope they can be used again. Now, Barry, when I discussed it with Barry and Rich, and they both thought it was a good idea. Barry was extremely enthusiastic, as he always is. I could imagine his moustache twitching when he heard the story and so on. But anyway, he, of course, as we all know, Barry is our mayor and a very stalwart member of our church here. Very detailed man, does things exceptionally well. And he's written all these, as Richard said, all these descriptions here. So we look forward to hearing from you, Barry. But I hand over to you, please. Thank you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is lovely to see so many of you here, as has been said. I think Rich has mentioned that some of the figures may extend their legs. So I'm just repeating that health warning. If you go into one of the pews where the figures are, obviously that's where the legs are, but we've designed this so that you go into one pew and the figures are in the pew behind. If you're as short-sighted as I am, you may well need to get a little bit closer. Please don't think that I am going to talk about all 100 figures. We would be here until well past my bedtime, perhaps not yours, but past mine. So it's going to be a selection. And what I would also say is I am merely the warm-up act. The 100 figures are the stars themselves, as I'm sure you will realise when you look around. I know we do have some historians here, some notable historians of Beccles. I hope that even they will find something that they didn't know before. I'm going to start with a teenager. Perhaps that surprises you. And a teenager who was not very well behaved. And actually, it's because he was not very well behaved that Beccles really became Beccles and flourished as it did in its early history. And this teenager was called Edwy, or sometimes known as Eardwy, or Eardwy the Fair. He was on the throne of England, well, particularly Wessex, for less than 3 years. But he gave away, in the first year of his reign, 956, more land than any European monarch ever gave away in a year until the 12th century. Now, why would a king give so much away? Well, I wonder if it's like a prime minister giving places in the cabinet to their friends. That is one idea. He wanted to reward his friends with land and make sure they stayed loyal. But another idea, for which there is some evidence, is that Edwy, who was a wayward youth who became king when he was only 15 and died when he was 19, wanted to atone for his misdeeds. Now, we are in a church, so of course, I am not going to tell you about his misdeeds, but they are on the internet. And I think there's a good chance that he gave Beccles to the priests, not the monks at this time, the priests guarding the tomb of St. Edmund at Bury St. Edmunds, that he gave the priests Beccles because he wanted to say sorry for what he had been doing. Now, why did he give away Beccles? Well, he wouldn't have given Beccles away if Beccles had been insignificant. So he wouldn't have given away Lowestoft. There's no one here from them. Because at that time, Lowestoft was extremely insignificant. And he wouldn't have given away Yarmouth because that was the idea. I don't think it was even a sandbank. It was the idea of a sandbank. So Beccles must have been worth giving away. It wasn't an insult. And there's a good case that when he gave away part of his royal estate in this part of England, he gave away perhaps the most significant settlement in this royal estate. Now, we have very little evidence for the early history of Beccles. The Vikings destroyed deeds and records that would have existed. But I think we owe a lot to Edwin because as a consequence of his giving Beccles to those priests who later built the great abbey of Bury in 1020, Beccles was in the hands of the church. It wasn't in the hands of a knightly or baronial family, as Banbury was with the Biggles. So although we didn't have a castle here, we had stability and security, and of course, that promoted trade. And Beccles became, as recorded in the Domesday Book of 1086, one of the few places in England recorded as a market town, a tribute to its stability. And when, in the reign of William the Conqueror, quite a few merchants of Norwich decided they'd had enough with all the goings on in Norwich, where did they go? They looked around. They couldn't find anywhere in Norfolk. Well, a few did, but most of them came to Beccles, even though it meant crossing the Waveney and coming to Suffolk. So they were an important part of the early merchant and trading community of Beccles. And we look a little bit further on to the Middle Ages. Of course, the Old Market, which probably was first of all used for fish, needed to be supplemented with the New Market. A very large property was built called the Long Rent, which was built by the Abbey, and it's probably represented today by a straight line of houses in the walk. That was a testament to the confidence that the Abbey had in Beccles. And perhaps that great building was built to house the craftsmen and officials who came from the Abbey to build this church from about 1370. The Abbey also had Beccles become a centre of learning, and in its history, learning has been very important. Beccles had a school in the early Middle Ages, and one of the consequences of that was that a lot of local boys, obviously it was only boys in those days, right, got an education, and a lot of them took the name de Beccles, and we find them in all sorts of places in Suffolk and Norfolk. Now, I don't think that these de Beccles men were actually related, some of them may be, but we find Daniel de Beccles, whom you may have heard of, who wrote a handbook of manners, 3,000 lines of Latin, which is certainly worth reading in its translation. William de Beccles was the cellarer of the Abbey, a really important job. He had the keys to the cellars, he bought the food for the Abbey, he was responsible for lands as well. Then there was Daniel de Beccles, a trusted official of the Bishop of Norwich, and he had the job of distributing money for the poor. And it's even recorded that he distributed some to the poor of this area, to Wellingham. Then another de Beccles was the Abbot of Sigton Abbey. Unfortunately, not all of the de Beccles were such well-behaved and eminent people. Alexander de Beccles, who had been a priest, I believe, murdered another priest, the parson of St. Peter's, Dunwich, in 1423. So you will see from the various figures that Beccles owes a great deal to its schools. I'm sure you all know about Sir John Lemon. I hope you say Lemon and not Lehman, as children do today. Of course it's Lemon. Who thinks it's Lehman? No one thinks it's Lehman. Okay, when Sir John Levin had his great mayoral progress when he was Lord Mayor of London, one of the floats had lemons on it. So of course it's lemon. Perhaps the current students of the school who love to call it lemon don't like the idea that they might be called lemons. Now, of course, the Sir John Levin School has educated some notable people. First of all, Dorothy Crowfoot Hodgkin, internationally known Nobel laureate. She is one of the figures. But we also have Sir John Mills, the famous actor, Sir Stanley Rouse. How many of you have heard of Sir Stanley Rouse? Good, quite a few of you, because you're probably football fans. Well, he was a great referee, president of FIFA. He was educated, first of all, at the Pupil Teacher Centre in Fair Close, in the Institute that's now been knocked down. And then he moved to the new Sir John Levin Grammar School when it opened in 1914. But another particularly noticeable school was the Falkenberg School, and its students were particularly well known, became well known for leaving Beccles and going to foreign lands. And I'm just going to pull out one example, and that is Charles Cobbold Farr, who was born in 1851. He emigrated to Canada in 1870. First of all, he was a clerk and journeyman bottle washer at a lumber camp. He had all sorts of jobs, cutting down trees, working as a stable boy. But then he had a stroke of luck. He joined the Hudson Bay Company and became an agent collecting furs. Then he had some even more significant luck because he bought a large block of land. He built himself a log hut. He actually encouraged other people from Beccles to join him. And a town called Haileybury, after his other school, developed and he became the mayor. But the stroke of luck, the second stroke of luck, was that the land he bought was very rich in silver. And he was able to buy further land, and he started the Haileybury newspaper. But in 1922, 90% of the town of Haileybury was destroyed by fire and whipped up by hurricane winds, and 3,500 people were left homeless. So rather sad end to his life. But it seems that he's the only person who might have started a settlement called Beccles. I spent quite a long time trying to find out if there's a Beccles anywhere else in the world. And there isn't at the moment, but he might have founded Beccles, which then died out. I was really puzzled about why, because lots of places in England have a counterpart in America, Canada, you can probably think of examples. But my conclusion was that, of course, nobody going abroad would want to name anywhere after Beccles because there's absolutely no place like Beccles. Is there? You will find lots of other people, boys, men, educated at the Falkenberg School that had many different locations in Beccles, but perhaps most notably it's Mary's House at the end of the Valley Gate. And there is still the arch of the school with the Falkenberg lion, the blue lion of the Falkenberg family, which is actually on the town's coat of arms, because the school was considered to be so significant. And Dr. Henry Falkenberg's tomb, you can see the lion, is just to the left of the small door there. Don't worry, one of the dolphins of Sir John Levin is also on the town's coat of arms. Now, we can't talk about Beccles without saying more about trade and commerce. In the Middle Ages, as some of you will know, Beccles was at least the third town of Suffolk after Ipswich in the lead and Bury St Edmunds. But there is one record of taxpayers that shows that Beccles was second to Ipswich at that period. Perhaps the taxpayers in Bury St Edmunds were very good at paying tax. But a very significant place, and that is, of course, one of the reasons why this is such a huge church. We often get visitors in here and they say, why is it so big? Well, Beccles was very important and it had a large population. So, of course, it needed a big church to accommodate. Now, many of the significant families of Beccles actually began as shopkeepers. And a good example is perhaps the most notable of all Beccles families, the Crowfords, the Crowford doctors. And over there's a long list of all the Crowford doctors, most of them were called William. But they also, the Crowfords have also had lots of other notable descendants. You will find 5, 6, 7 of the figures have Crowford blood in their veins. Now, shopkeepers didn't always run their shops. Many were involved in other aspects of town life. And one example I'm going to pull out is Isaac Lowes. Now, he is buried under a slab in the South Aisle. I think there's a monument to him in the chapel as well. He was a draper. You can make a lot of money in the 18th century from being a draper. And he was the postmaster. And he was several times the port reeve of Beccles. Now, the word port reeve makes some people think that Beccles was a port and therefore had to have a port reeve. But the name port reeve does not link to whether Beccles was a port or not. It's a different derivation. It was a kind of mayor, the port reeve. He was the head of the corporation. And I'd just like to read some words from his monument. And he lived a very long life, as you will see from his description in one of the figures. During his long life, he was distinguished by an ardent zeal to promote the credit and prosperity of his native town. In his private character, he was hospitable and benevolent, giving readily of the abundance he possessed and seeking upon all occasions to administer relief and comfort to the poor and needy. Now, sometimes on tombs, there are very empty words. I expect you've been to a church and you've read it and you think, can that really be true? And sometimes it just can't. But we know it was true in his case because over 2,000 people thronged the streets of Beccles for his funeral. Out of a population of about 5,000 at the time, a huge number. There was a torchlit procession from his house. He lived in what is now Market Street. It used to be called Blowers Lane in his lifetime, to this church. So just think of what he would have seen in his life. 90 years or so, most of the 18th century and into the 19th century. There are some more recent shopkeepers. How many of you remember the ironmongers Clatterings? I certainly do. They were a great shop, weren't they? Well, one of the Clatterings is one of the figures. It's where Bailey's delicatessen is today. But manufacturing has also been very important in the history of Beccles. Tanning and brewing, brickmaking, but as some of you know, the greatest industry of all was printing. But manufacturing of iron products was also important. So who started printing in Beccles? Well, it was actually the man who I think is the biggest villain amongst the figures. We could have an interesting discussion because William Reed, and I'm sorry that some of you might live in Will Reed Close, but William Reed runs him a very close second. But William Moore came to Beccles. It seems that he had been an army officer. It's very hard to believe a lot of what's written about him. But he came to Beccles and he got into some sort of business arrangement with a man called Reed Crisp. Reed Crisp started the very first Beccles newspaper in the 1850s. He was very successful with this newspaper. He started it as a monthly paper. After a very short time, it became a weekly. And of course, it's the ancestor of today's Beccles. Now, Reed Crisp was, I think, induced into some sort of business arrangement with William Moore. William Moore set up what William Moore called the Caxton Press. Now, William Moore was nothing other than a trickster on a massive scale. He bought the very large property Northgate House, that's still there today. He built Douglas Place, named after one of his sons, in the garden, and that is on Ravensmere. He put a lot of his workers, women workers, young girls who worked in the printing business, he boarded them at Northgate House, probably in very cramped conditions. But after a while, in fact, after he'd entered into another business arrangement, this time with the Clowes cousins from London, the printers, it was discovered that he had completely fabricated a huge collection of documents, various deeds and financial documents, and he didn't have the money that he claimed he had. Now, Paul Reed Crisp was never paid the annuity that William Moore had promised him. The Clowes cousins were nearly ruined, but they did manage to keep the printing business going. What did William Moore do? Well, he decamped to Scotland, where he managed to buy a very large estate. Again, with false documents, he actually sent one of his sons to Eton. So we're talking about fraud on a huge scale. Now, I bet you're thinking, I hope he came to a very sticky end. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, right? I thought something like that. Well, he ended up in prison. I do feel sorry for his son, who must have been called to the head teacher's office one day and to be told that he could no longer be a pupil at his school because of what his father had done. So that was William Moore. But if William Moore had not started the Caxton Press, which was then taken over by the Clowes, we would not have had a great Clowes printing works, employing over 1,000 people at one stage. And of course, the Clowes are still here at Ella. So sometimes villainy, perhaps I shouldn't say this, sometimes villainy can have an unexpectedly good consequence. Now, that was William Moore. I'm giving you an opposite, and that is William Elliot. I expect you've heard of Elliot and Darude, the manufacturing company. Well, William Elliot was the prime mover. He founded the Ingate Ironworks based in Gosford Road. You may be thinking, well, his geography of Beccles was not very good. Gosford Road, nothing to do with Ingate, but his first location was in Blythegate and had a back door onto what was then called Ingate Road, which was then renamed as Grove Road because people were getting very confused with an Ingate Road and also the Ingate Street. So these days we have Grove Road and we have Ingate. But William Elliot was not just very good at his job, and he particularly specialised in the manufacture of capstans, but he was also a great philanthropist. He took his employees on all sorts of summer trips, cruising along the river and so on. He built a home for his retired workers at Harboridge, a farm where some of his sick or retired people could go. He built the Institute in Fair Close and the lecture room. So he is right at the top of my wonderful people of Beccles. Now, the professions. Well, I've mentioned the Crowfoot doctors, but other doctors have played their part. I'm going to mention one called Dr. John Chambers. Now, he bought St. Peter's House, it's still there today, at the end, or one side of Old Market, and he added the two wonderful Gothic rooms at the rear. He's also notable because he wrote a herbal. He didn't publish it in Beccles, he published it in 1800 Ardingly. And as well as writing about all sorts of herbs, all sorts of medicines, there's also a section on bathing and electricity. Well, I think there's one section on bathing and there's one on electricity. I don't worry, don't keep muddled up having a bath and turning on the electricity. Now, my favourite doctor is actually Dr. George Fox. Now, he was a Quaker, but no connection with the famous George Fox, who was really the prime mover of the Quakers in the 17th century. But our George Fox was absolutely no relation. I researched his family tree. I'm absolutely sure it wasn't, and it goes back to Cornwall in the 17th century, and Quakers even then in Cornwall. So no relation, but George Fox was very notable for many things, doctor and Beccles, but particularly for supporting adult education. He came to Beccles as a kind of junior partner of Dr. Crowfoot. Dr. Crowfoot seems to have built him a very nice house in Blythegate that is still there, the house. And George Fox, early 1900s, began an adult school. Now, he would have known about adult schools because adult schools were run by Quakers all over England at the time. And a lot of great Quaker families, such as the Rowntrees, supported them. And it was through funds from some of those families that George Fox was able to build, first of all, upstairs at the Quaker building of Smallgate, and then a completely new hall, that of course is still there today. And the adult schools were remarkably popular for men and women. I've looked at the handbook. It wasn't Mickey Mouse learning. It included Shakespeare and all sorts of things. Now, you may be wondering, why did people in Beccles have such a yearning, adults in Beccles, to have some education? Well, of course, a lot of them had left school, they'd gone to school at all, with very little learning. It wasn't until 1870 schools really began to be provided for most children in England. But I think there are some other reasons, and I think the printing industry comes in because, contrasted with other jobs at the time, in printing, there was a way of progressing. In most jobs, you learned the trade, you went in, you stayed at that level. But in printing, you could go in at a relatively medium level, you could become a compositor, you could rise to become a reader, somebody who proofread all sorts of documents. And we know that some people became readers at the Caxton Press in Beccles, learned foreign languages so that they could become readers. And it was a well-paid job. And I think a lot of the printing staff were very keen to go and take advantage of opportunities for adult education. Dr. Fox was so successful that other local towns started their own adult schools, including Bungay. There are several other figures from the 19th century who supported adult education in Beccles. Another is George Fenn. Now, he was certainly a man of many parts. He tried to make a living as an artist specialising in horses. He went to Newmarket, and actually his paintings are good, but he couldn't make a living. So he came back to Beccles. He was an auctioneer. He was the town surveyor. He owned a lime kiln, he became mayor, and he supported the Working Men's Institute. And in 1856, he was given a silver salver with this inscription: presented to George Fenn, Esquire, Mayor, October the 30th, 1856, by the working classes of Beccles, as a tribute of gratitude and respect for his zealous and faithful endeavours to promote the interests and the general welfare of the town. I'm not dropping the hints, but George Fenn's life was one of the successes and failures. Not everything he tried to do was a success. He tried to reinstate the horse racing in common, and it went reasonably well for a short time, but it then faded away. I think he actually had quite a row with the rector at the time over the bears, but I won't go into that. But he did succeed with one thing, and that was his idea for draining the marshes. And his idea was to use a pumping engine, and you can still see, in fact, it's an upgraded pump, but the building he constructed, you can actually still see on the marshes to this day. Now, another proponent of adult education, this time it's a lady, was a very unassuming individual, Anne Shaw Parker. And she lived from 1833 to 1910. Her father was a farmer in Gillingham, and when she and he moved to Beccles when he retired, she gave up being a school teacher, and she really devoted the rest of her life to adult education with her friend Mary Crowfoot. And she started a working men's club for recreation and instruction, and also a night school for lads where they could learn reading, which would be taught how to read and write, paint and make picture frames. And there's a memorial just by the door here to her, and it says that she was a true friend. And I think that many people in Beccles from all walks of life would have certainly caught it. I've referred to schools, so I won't expand on that. I'll turn to a solicitor, the great Samuel Wilton Ricks. You might have heard of him. He spent his spare time collecting all sorts of historical documents, which formed what's later called the Ricks Collection, which is very useful to any historian in Beccles. And those records have now been copied digitally, and they can be viewed in the museum. But there were other notable members of the Ricks family. One of the figures, Ricks' granddaughter, Dame Catherine Jones. But Ricks also had a son, F.S. Ricks, who was still practicing in Beccles as a solicitor when he was 96. Now, at the time, Beccles was notable for the longevity of its inhabitants. It was thought that the air in Beccles was particularly kind to people, and that they would live to a very good age. That was one reason Beccles was notable. It was also notable because it was one of the very few places in England where people who lived in it did not pay any rates at all. Don't say anything to me about the town council, but our rates are still amongst the lowest in Suffolk. Now, there are several writers amongst the 100 figures, some internationally known, such as Henry James, the novelist, and Arthur Ransom, who wrote the Coot Club books. Some of you have read those as a child, I'm sure. He's very popular in Japan, his art person. And one of his Czech admirers is actually named an asteroid after him. That is star recognition. The poet George Crabbe married Beccles' girl, Sarah Elmy. He was married in his church. He was also the priest. He preached from this very pulpit. I'd like to mention someone you may not have heard of, Mary Lemon Grimstone, 1796 to 1869. She was a descendant of both the Lemon family and the Reed family, so she was related to the villains. She went to Australia, and she wrote what has been called the first Australian novel. So she's probably more known there than here. In the 1830s, she wrote for Robert Owen's New Moral World newspaper. And she argued that men and women should be held to the same moral standards. What a revolutionary idea in the 19th century. So she was not very popular with a certain group of men. Now, you will find all sorts of people amongst the figures, some who started life with difficulty. I'm going to give you one or two examples. I'm going to start with Fred Copeland. How many of you have heard of Fred Copeland? It's a good Beccles name, Copeland, somebody has. He was born in the workhouse. He was brought up in a children's home in Beccles. He went into the Navy. He helped organise the Inver-Gordon Mutiny in 1931, when the government tried to reduce sailors' pay. He later spent several periods in prison for defying bans on demonstrations and marches. So I think he might have been marching today. And in his dark times in his prison cell, could he have imagined that one day, some years later, he would have been in Buckingham Palace giving talks to the royal household about protection against German air raids? In fact, his work during the Second World War in that area was so notable that he was made an OBE. So what a transformation from being in prison, from growing up in poverty, being born in the workhouse. But there are opposites. Some people started high and were reduced. One example is Sir John Pettus. Now, as a young man who was in the highest circles, royal circles, he was knighted at a young age. But later in life, he ended in a debtor's prison. So he went in the other direction. But it was Sir John Pettus who, I think through his royal connections, persuaded Charles II to give the ruined leper hospital at the end of Ballycate to the people of Beccles. So we owe a debt of gratitude. I hope you will find surprises. For instance, would you believe that a dressmaker built a church in Beccles? Stand silence. Well, he did. He was a court dressmaker. A dressmaker to the royal court. He retired to Beccles. Alfred Woods, and in Waverley Road, we built what was called Christ Church. It was really a very large room made of marble. Unfortunately, and I cannot understand this, it burned down. How can a church made of iron burn down? But sadly, it did. But he had a very interesting life. He was the friend of the man who founded the YMCA, as his description says. And what about an actress? And some of you will have heard of her. Sarah Siddons, the famous Shakespearean actress. She came to Beccles. She was a friend of one of the ministers of, I think I'm right, Hungate. I think it was Mr. Sigworth. See if he's going to nod. I think it was Mr. Sloper, Isaac Sloper, who lived in London Road. He was a friend of Sarah Siddons. It was all about board. She played the part of Hamlet. Can you believe it? The male part of Hamlet. She played the male part of Hamlet in the early 19th century. If a woman played Hamlet today, wouldn't we say, come on, we all want to move with the times, but it's not quite on. But she was such a notable actress, she could play any male or female. And then, what about the singer who was in the top 20 for 6 months, who gave his very last public performance in Beccles? And I'm pretty sure that some of you would have been there. And I'll give you a clue. As well as singing, he whistled. Does anybody know who I'm talking about? Yes? Yes. You'll find the details. Wrongly enough. So, 7 of the figures are commemorated in this church. On the north wall over there, you'll find a memorial to Robert Davey, master of the preschool, the John Lennon School. He had time to do other things. Can you imagine a head teacher these days doing anything other than being in his school or working at home in the evenings or Sundays? I speak to some feeling. He was the the grandson of Beccles Baker. He became master of the preschool at an early age, but he was also a surveyor. He surveyed the corporation lands. He was also an artist. And what's interesting about his monument, it is decorated with symbols of Freemasonry, including a pair of compasses. He was the first master of the Society of the Apollo Lodge, the Beccles Masonic Lodge. And in the Memorial Chapel, you will find a commemoration of the naturalist Joseph Arnold, who helped discover the world's largest flower, Rafflesia onodi, and it's also said to be the smelliest flower in the world. So I'm sure no gardening enthusiast from Beccles is going to try to grow it. I hope they won't. There isn't much of a chance because Arnold helped find it in Sumatra, so it's not going to grow the Beccles unless you've got very large greenhouses. So as you walk round and come to the end, you might like to ask yourself, whom would I most have liked to have met? Perhaps Charles II at the King's Head. It was there when he visited. Well, we're not sure he got over his coat, but he certainly came through. But perhaps if you're a lady, you wouldn't have wanted to meet him. I leave that with you. Or perhaps you would like to have shared a bottle of wine with the French emigre Chateaubriand in his lodgings in Saltgate. Or Sir David Frost. Imagine being interviewed by him. I think I'd settle for a cup of tea with Dorothy Crowfoot Hodgkin, not discussing X-ray crystallography, which I would not have understood, but how she campaigned for peace, because she was a great campaigner for peace. So, I very much hope you enjoyed your evening. If you're anything like me, after about 40 figures, you will glaze over, as I do, when I'm confronted by 40 or 50 varieties of yogurt at once. So, please don't feel you're a failure if you decide to come back another day. That is what we expect. And bring your friends, of course. I've mentioned Chateaubriand. There's going to be a play in this church at 2:30 on Saturday about Chateaubriand. No tickets. There'll be an opportunity to give a donation at the end if you wish to, but please think about coming to learn more about Chateaubriand, one of 100 figures. I'm very happy to take just a few questions. I'm saying a few because I'm sure most of you are just itching to meet more of the figures. But does anybody have a question? I will be here, I'll be walking around, so if you do have a question, please feel free to ask me. No, yes, one question. Okay. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
We are truly blessed in this place for lots of reasons Barry mentioned, but we're truly blessed to have Barry with us as part of our community and our church family. Barry, thank you from all of us. Again, thank you to all the team. The one I forgot to mention, it was on my list, is our flower rangers who have done the greenery around some of the displays and the flowers to my right as well. So thank you to all our team. We want you to enjoy the space, and the exhibition's on until Sunday the 30th. 10 till 4 every day, 2 till 4 on Sundays for obvious reasons on a Sunday. But please do come. You look as much as you like tonight. There's more shadows behind in the chancel. Come on the other days and enjoy the space and enjoy the exhibition. Encourage other people to come. This is our biggest fundraiser that we've done for some time, and it costs a lot of money to keep this church maintained and running. We've kept the ticket price really low tonight, and you've got a drink with your ticket price. You can buy a second drink, a third drink if you want to tonight, but we really also appreciate your donations to keep St. Michael's alive and at the heart of our community. Thank you for being here. Enjoy being around.